Here at the very beginning this morning, I must confess that I have attempted to listen to the account of Jesus healing the 10 lepers from a very different vantage point this week. I'm very much aware that only one of the 10 lepers returned to offer thanks to Jesus for his healing. I'm also aware that for Luke, this expression of gratitude by a foreigner, a Samaritan, is of great significance. For Luke sees it that an outsider grasps something that the insiders cannot, that Jesus is more than an itinerant preacher from Nazareth. When we take New Testament studies, one of the things our professors encourage us to do as students of the parables is to find ourselves in the story. Where are you? Who are you? Where are you standing? What would you be saying if you were in the stories that Jesus tells? I took that this morning to say, where would I have been in this story about Jesus healing 10 lepers? Because I'm also aware this morning that oftentimes as we praise the Samaritan for his expression of gratitude for thanking Jesus, we also tend to take an attitude of judgment toward the other 9. These other 9, well, just supply your own adjective. They're ungrateful. They're thankless. They're selfish. They're self-indulgent. We don't have very many images of them that evoke kindness or compassion. So for today, I've tried to listen to this story from a different vantage point. I want for us to imagine for a moment what these other 9 ungrateful or grateful lepers did. You see, these 10 lepers were living like lepers did in the first century. Their illness bound them together. They could not live in community. They had to leave their homes, their families, their villages, and wander about, and so they coalesced together. They were forced to take care of one another because nobody else would or could, and they had to exercise appropriate diligence. Whenever someone came near, came close, they were obliged to stand and yell, "Go away, unclean, unclean, unclean." You can understand why for these 10 lepers, Jesus was perhaps their only hope. And so they cry out together, "Master, have mercy on us." And then all 10 of them do exactly what Jesus told them to do. They take off to go and show themselves to the priest. According to Leviticus, only a priest could declare that a leper was cleansed. Only a priest could give permission for a leper, a former leper, to go home, back to his family, back to his community, back to his town. But as they are going to the priest, something happens. Along the way, Luke says, they were cleansed. They were healed. No explanation is offered, but somehow while they were on their way to the priest, the evidence of their leprosy disappeared. One of them, yes, the Samaritan, recognizes what has happened, returns to Jesus, falls on his feet, and offers thanks to him. Now, what follows is difficult to understand. Jesus asks several questions that he obviously knows the answer to. He asks, were there not 10 lepers cleansed? Yes, Jesus, you know that. But the other 9, where are they? And Jesus knows the answer to that question too, for they are doing exactly what he told them to do. They are on their way to the priest to show themselves to him. They're on their way to complete the ritual of purification. They are already dreaming, perhaps, of a joyful and glad reunion with their families when they finally get home. Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? And again, Jesus knows the answer too. There's only one present there, the Samaritan. But I ask you this morning, does that really mean that the others did not offer praise and thanksgiving to God for healing their bodies and restoring their lives? This week I have tried to listen for the voices of these other 9 lepers. And as of yet, I have not found myself able to imagine a single one of them going home, walking through the door, and casually saying, "What's for dinner, honey?" But I have imagined joyful arrivals home. I have seen a wife throwing her arms around her husband's neck, kissing him squarely on the lips, tears joyfully rolling down her cheeks. I have seen the newly restored man kissing his daughter on the top of her head, running his finger through her hair, holding her in his arms, tickling her feet. I have seen him grabbing his son, throwing him up in the air, punching him slightly in the stomach, giving him a dry haircut with his knuckles. And long after the family celebration is over, I have seen these 9 lepers counting their fingers and their toes. I have seen their wives running their hands across their faces, touching every wrinkle and crevice. And yes, I have imagined that they were indeed thanking God Almighty that Jesus had healed them. And for the first time in a very long time, the family prays together. And for the rest of their lives, these 9 lepers live thankfully. It's hard, despite our temptation to judge these 9 lepers, to believe that they lived the rest of their lives thanklessly. And I can't imagine Jesus condemning them for simply doing what he had told them to do. Go and show yourself to the priest. But somehow, because of things I have seen, not in the first century, but in the world in which I presently live, I believe that these 9 lepers may have expressed their gratitude through thankful living. In the small town I grew up in, there was a man named Red Moore. Boys and girls like me were given permission to call him Mr. Red. He was tall, and they say in his younger days there was a shock of red hair that stood on top of his head. That's the reason for his nickname, Red. Mr. Red owned Moore's Dry Cleaning. It was the Saturday afternoon place to be in Cowpens for males only. Inside the dry cleaners, there was a broken down old couch, some seats from the theater that had closed years ago, and a narrow ledge along the window. And any time after 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, every seat was taken. There was an old television with a set of rabbit ears sitting up on top. The picture was bad. There was haze. There was lines floating across the screen. But in the background, there always played some ball game in season or ABC's Wide World of Sports. Above the counter, which ran the full length of the dry cleaners, was a row of black frames, one after the other, almost 30 of them, holding pictures of young men in baseball uniforms, American Legion baseball teams. In about half of those pictures, the teams were holding the championship trophy. They had been the American Legion state champs of South Carolina. And the coach, well, who was the coach? Red Moore. As I got older, sometimes on my way to school, I would stop into Calpin's drugstore to pick up something that I needed. Calpin's drugstore was one of those old drugstores with a counter, a soda fountain, and a grill manned by a man named Frank Oglesby. On most mornings, you would find little boys and little girls, legs dangling, sitting on the stools at the counter. Half a dozen or more, boys or girls, eating breakfast. Now, personally, I've never considered Chef Boyardee spaghetti or vegetable soup or tomato soup breakfast fare. But that was all that could be served at the counter at Calpin's drugstore. There was no breakfast in the schools back then. And Mr. Red fed this ragtag bunch of boys and girls breakfast in the drugstore every morning before school. There was one little boy in our town named Broadus. Broadus was trouble coming. He wore the same thing every single day. A pair of bib overalls, a dirty white t-shirt, and brogans without socks. That was until cold weather arrived, and when it started getting chilly, Mr. Red would bring Broadus down to my grandfather's store and buy the boy 2 flannel shirts, a jacket, and some gray boot socks with red toes. And Broadus would go out like he was dancing on the top of the world. Mr. Redmore was a quiet and gentle man, loved by children and respected by the adults of our community most of the time. It felt good to be around Mr. Red. And even when I became a man, when I was home, I would go back to Redmore's on Saturday afternoon between 4 and 6 just to be a boy again. Now, you cannot know this, but Mr. Redmore was living a life of thanksgiving or thanks living. You see, there was a time many, many years ago, before I ever moved to Calpins, when Redmore was the most notorious alcoholic in our town. Notorious primarily because he came from one of the more respected families in town. Red had started drinking when he was very, very young. Some folks said he squandered a professional baseball career because he couldn't leave the bottle alone. His most redeeming quality? He had married a beautiful young teacher from Georgia named Stella. Red and Stella were married. A little boy with a shock of red hair just like his dad came along. And that's when the alcoholism made life a nightmare for all of them. It got so bad that Miss Stella packed up all her things and the little boy and headed back to Georgia. It was then that Mr. Red decided to do something. He had a couple of his friends lock him up in his house. They nailed the windows shut and they put padlocks on the front and the back doors. Redmore went cold turkey. He didn't bathe. He didn't shave. He was left all alone in that house on Main Street in Cowpens. Redmore was determined to get sober or die. And by the grace of God, he would tell you, he came out of that house one day looking like death, but very much alive. And for the rest of his life, his living was what I would describe as thanks living. That's why he coached American Legion baseball teams. That's why he fed a ragtag bunch of little boys and girls from the wrong side of the tracks breakfast each morning in the drugstore. That's why Redmore would be the only man that Broadus would ever trust his whole life long. Mr. Red was one of those people who learned how to master living out of a sense of gratitude and thankfulness for the life. A life that had become his. I have a whole balcony full of people like Mr. Red. In that balcony, there is a white-haired Texan I came to know. And maybe for a time, he lived life large like Texans are supposed to do, doing things in a big way. But World War II came along, and he found himself in the Air Corps flying missions across the English Channel into Nazi-occupied Europe. On one mission, his plane was shot up badly. The pilot managed to nurse it back to England and to land it. For the most of the members of his crew, that was their last flight. This long, lean Texan later went back to look at his airplane. The place where he had been standing all the way back across the channel was riddled with bullet holes. How had he survived, he wondered. Why had he survived, he wondered. And that day, in thanksgiving to God, he began a quest of thanks living. And it was good to be in this Texan's presence. He made you feel good about yourself and who you were. He could make you laugh when you felt like crying. He made you feel loved when love was elusive. You see what I'm betting on this morning? I'm betting on that at least half of these 9 lepers that did exactly what Jesus did lived their lives like Mr. Red and this long, tall Texan. They were thankful to God for the rest of their lives, and they lived lives that offered thanks. Now, in my opinion, yes, Jesus is impressed by the Samaritan who comes back and gives thanks. I don't have to tell you that the Samaritans were held in very low opinion by all Jews. And Jesus even refers to him as a foreigner. Jesus himself, I think, is surprised that the Samaritan comes to give thanks. Perhaps because this Samaritan would be a stranger to the God that Jesus was trying to reveal. He is surprised by this Samaritan, but he may have expected the other 9 lepers to give thanks as well. For they already knew the words of David. The Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and His truth to all generations. It's one thing, I think, to be grateful, to be thankful in a moment of time. It's another thing, I think, to be grateful and thankful in such a way that the rest of your life you live in a different way. Now, in conclusion, I come to the Gadarene demoniac. There's no character in the entire New Testament that I admire more than the Gadarene demoniac. I can't imagine, nor can you imagine, what he had to do to keep his life together till that day when he met Jesus. Death came after him day after day. And now, here he is, sitting at the feet of Jesus with his clothes on and in his right mind. His neighbors don't know what to say or do because for their whole lives, this man has been that crazy man running through the cemetery, howling like a dog, cutting himself up, mutilating his body, living like the dead among the tombstones. Neighbors don't know what to do with him. And because they don't know what to do with him, they don't know what to do with Jesus either. So they ask him to please leave town. Jesus gets in a boat to do just that. And the Gadarene demoniac runs up and pleads with Jesus to be able to go with him. Jesus refuses his request. Jesus will not let him go with him and become his disciple. Jesus tells the demoniac, now in his right mind, go home. Go home. Go home and tell the folks back home what God has done for you. Now, I think in our world today, it's very difficult to express our thanks and our gratitude for the blessings of life. They're not nearly as fresh in our minds as perhaps they were for others peoples in other times when life was more fragile than it is today. But I do think the greatest challenge that any of us could face is to begin to live out our thanksgiving. To live thankful lives that move us beyond ourselves to touch the lives of other folks. It's one thing, and I will do it with my family on Thanksgiving Day, and perhaps you will do it with yours too. We will sit down at the table, and before anyone can eat, everyone will have to express at least two things that they are thankful for. We will say to each other what we are thankful for. We will, before we eat our Thanksgiving dinner, acknowledge God for His blessings. But it is quite another thing to take those things that we are grateful and thankful for and begin to live differently, to live generously, to share what we have with others abundantly, to remove ourselves from center stage and take a place in the crowd, to live each day with a deep awareness that this day that God has given me is a gift. It's a gift. I did not earn it. I can't keep it. It's a gift to be lived today. To live with thanksgiving is to trust with all your being that the core of all of creation, there is goodness. God is good. Creation is good. This liberates us to live without fear. To live believing that we are not diminished by what we share, that we lose nothing in what we have by sharing it with each other, but in fact, the gifts we share multiply, touching and shaping lives and inspiring others to give thanks unto God. I suspect it is only in sharing our lives that we live truly grateful and thankful lives. In sharing of ourselves. And yes, I'm grateful for that Samaritan that came and gave Jesus thanks for his healing. But if I'm in this story, I'm one of those other 9 on my way home. And I hope somehow in becoming clean and being reunited with my family, I would spend the rest of my life in thanks living. But most of all today, I identify with the Gadarene demoniac. How do I go back home? How do I go back where the people know who I am? How do I go back where people think they think my thoughts and know my ways? How do I go back and embody thanks living before them? How do I show them what God has done for me? So today, as we make our way slowly to Thursday and Thanksgiving Day, I would encourage each of us to at least ponder for a while between now and Thursday what it might mean for us, not simply to offer thanks, but to live as an expression of our gratitude and our thanksgiving day by day among the people who know us. Let's try to imagine walking in the shoes of the Gadarene demoniac.